Historically, wrestling in its various forms has been a predominantly male sport. This, in some ways, is to be expected, given the nature of it being combat-oriented. From ancient times to now, it seems that there are more men into combat sports in general than women. However, the rather unfortunate fact that underpins this discrepancy is that for the longest time, women were held back in wrestling, as well as at times being held back from even participating in wrestling. In the 1930s and 40s, due to figures like Mildred Burke, there was a shift taking place within professional wrestling. Previously, women were as good as barred from taking part in wrestling events. While I couldn't find any official legislation forbidding women from taking part, at the time the social climate was not in women's favor with regards to that. To give you an example, a woman who would go on to become one of the most iconic women's wrestlers in history was told by Ed Strangler Lewis, "I don't like girl wrestlers. Women should be in the kitchen, but after seeing you, you were born to be a wrestler." Ed Lewis was one of the Gold Dust trio who had pioneered professional wrestling's move from a shoot contest to a work. He was a pivotal figure in wrestling at this time, and it's likely that his attitude was reflective of the view of women's wrestlers at the time from the perspective of pro wrestling's top brass. And society's broader attitude towards women was restrictive, with much stricter behavioral standards and oppressive roles that were imposed upon women.
She must know how to cook. She must know how to set her table attractively. She must know how to make her home comfortable and inviting.
The recipient of this outdated compliment was none other than Mae Young, and you'll be glad to hear she took it in her stride, describing it as the greatest compliment she ever received. Born on March 12, 1923, Mae Young was the youngest of 8 children, one of whom had tragically passed away. Mae Young would grow up during the Great Depression, being raised by a single mother as the father had left the family to look for work and never returned. Her full name is Johnny Mae Young, named after the father she barely knew. Growing up with multiple brothers, Mae Young would become something of a tomboy, no doubt in order to hold her own in various sibling squabbles. She became something of a badass. In high school, she led her team to a national title in softball. Her brothers had taught her how to wrestle against boys, including allegedly luring neighborhood boys into their front yard, so Mae could beat them in a match. In the Lipstick and Dynamite documentary about the first ladies in wrestling, she claims to have wrestled dirty. Wrestling for the boys' team at school and defeating neighborhood kids had inspired Mae Young. She wanted to go pro. So the story goes that while she was still in high school, she went to a professional wrestling show and challenged Mildred Burke, despite the fact that she had been brought in to wrestle Gladys Gillum. Apparently the promoters informed her she couldn't just come in and wrestle the champion right off the bat. Fair enough, that was pretty unprecedented for a high schooler to come in asking for a title shot. Much like her identical twin, Michael Jordan, she took it personally. She explained that she could basically beat everybody in a shoot and was therefore stuck in the ring with Gladys Gillum, and within seconds she had beaten Gladys. Mae Young was quick and ferocious and fought dirty, allegedly going on to also beat Elvira Snodgrass in a shoot fight, at which point Billy Wolfe, the promoter of the show, said he could make a girl wrestler out of Mae Young. Within the context of the time, this makes sense. Kayfabe was still well protected, and most wrestlers were capable shooters, given the prevalence of double-crossing and the amount of catch wrestling knowledge wrestlers had at the time. A lot of the time, people would go to train to be a wrestler without knowing it was worked, but if they showed signs of promise, they would be brought in and smartened up to the business. There's some dispute, however, from Dave Meltzer, who suggests that Mae Young's first match was in 1941 and not 1939 or 1940, as Mae Young has recounted. Apparently, historians researching have been unable to find any records of her wrestling prior to 1941, when at the age of 18 she would go on tour with Billy Wolfe and his squad. I don't know. There's probably some truth to it all, but maybe some stories get mixed up together. It's difficult to figure out history from this time for a multitude of reasons, including that it's hard to pass shoot from work. Either way, she would meet Ed Lewis, which is where he dropped that comment. In Canada, in 1941, she would wrestle with Mildred Burke for Stu Hart, the patriarch of what would become the Hart wrestling family. Mae and Mildred would be the first girls to open up Canada for women's wrestling. She would also wrestle across the states, and was wrestling in Memphis, Tennessee, when the Pearl Harbor attack took place, bringing the United States of America into World War II. It was during the war that these pioneer women wrestlers would expand their role in wrestling. Men were being drafted off to war, leaving an open space for women to keep things going on as normal as possible at home. Working in many different territories, Mae Young, alongside Mildred Burke, Mae Weston, and Gladys Gillum would open up territories that previously hadn't been open to women's wrestling. During this time, Mae Young was repeatedly challenging Mildred Burke for the Women's World Championship, fighting under nicknames like the Queen and the Great Mae Young, and it was common knowledge amongst wrestlers that she was a legit shooter. Unfortunately, Billy Wolfe, the promoter and manager of all these women wrestlers, was a bit of a snake. There's a lot to go into about him in other videos, but basically Wolfe wasn't the best of people, and after a while Young would move on with her career and begin training a lady named Lillian Ellison, who would go on to become the Fabulous Moolah. Moolah would be the undefeated women's champion for 29 years, a game changer for women's wrestling, and of course, Mae Young's best friend. Mae Young would wrestle throughout the 1940s to the 1970s in her first major run, becoming the first NWA Florida Women's Champion in 1951, as well as becoming the first United States Women's Champion in 1968. She would wrestle for the WWF in 2 matches in 1969 and 1972, but would leave the wrestling business and retire during this time. As always with wrestling history during this time, it's unclear exactly when she retired for the first time, but it was during the 70s. During her initial retirement, Mae worked in the real estate business, however. In 1993, at the age of 70 years old, she would come out of retirement and wrestle for her best friend Fabulous Moolah's promotion, and she would make her return/debut with the WWF in 1999. As a famous hawk once said, a wild slapnuts appears. Jeff Jarrett is in the ring on SmackDown talking mad smack to Fabulous Moolah before attacking her. Mae Young runs in to try and save Moolah, but is taken down by Jarrett and put into a figure 4 leg lock. Based. During this time, Mae and Moolah were in a series of matches and angles that didn't necessarily reflect the legends they once were. But I felt as I was watching it that some of Jerry Lawler's commentary was a bit excessive. The matches and angles Mae Young took part in during that time were definitely played for laughs. But considering that this was a woman in her mid-70s, all I can say is she could still bloody move. I don't know many grannies that can take bumps like that, is all I'm saying. And it's this way that she was mostly played for laughs that's leading me to not cover her time in WWE here. Not because none of it was ever funny or I find anything particularly offensive about it, well, most of it, but because it was a pretty uneventful time in my opinion compared to the rest of her career and her impact on women's wrestling. Her time in WWE in her later years was just a bit of fun. Mae Young would be honored by being inducted into the Hall of Fame as part of the 2008 class. It's actually interesting. I really started to get into wrestling around the lead up to WrestleMania 24. So she was one of the first Hall of Fame inductees I had ever seen. I remember being amazed at how far back wrestling history went, and here I am now cracking out the documentaries. So in a way, thanks for that, Mae Young. After her Hall of Fame induction, she would go on to wrestle her last match on November 15th, 2010. This was during the old school gimmick Raw episode, so they brought on Young to win a Falls Count Anywhere handicap match against Laycool. This was less of a match and more of a mafia granny letting her ladies bring a couple loose ends to her that needed to be tied up. But I count it. This would make her the first person to wrestle over the age of 80 and the first person to wrestle in 9 different decades, which is of course disputed by Dave Meltzer. Dave claims that Mae Young only wrestled in 7 decades with no record of her wrestling before 1941, and him not counting her 2010 match, saying it didn't resemble a pro wrestling match. That's a pretty corny take coming from Dave Meltzer, isn't it? I'd still say, given she was making appearances and physically participating, that you could argue she had a wrestling career in 9 decades. I mean, come on Dave, no one's going to come close to beating it. Let's have the record, eh? On December 31st, 2013, Mae Young would be hospitalized, passing away weeks later on January 14th and being buried in the same cemetery as the Fabulous Moolah. The story of one of the most respected figures in professional wrestling history would come to a close. During her career, she was a 2-time singles champion and a 1-time tag champion. She broke barriers for women in wrestling. And according to classy Fred Blassie, she was capable of kicking the hell out of 67% of the men. She will forever be remembered as one of the greatest of all time. So rest in peace to the Queen, the great Mae Young.